All right, so we are going to finish up this module with the last video, which is going into a bit more detail about the principles underlying the Constitution, as well as a little bit of consideration of the relationship between American Indians and American settlers. So where we left off last time, I talked a little bit about Madison and his concern about the threats to liberty. He was a principal architect of the Constitution, and he was worried about a couple of key things. The first was factions, and the second was excessive concentration in the hands of government officials, excessive concentration of political power in the hands of government officials. The remedy for this was the implementation of several limitations on government power. And these were institutionalized with the idea that this would keep the government, make the government strong, but then also keep any one aspect of the government from overpowering the others. So these are the four constitutional principles that we want to cover. Altogether, the four are separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, and then the concept of limited government. So to start with separation of powers, think of the idea of just, when you're creating a government, you're creating a constitution, it is more dangerous to have all of the power kind of held in the hands of one branch or one part of the government. And so the founders of the Constitution decided to separate powers into three primary branches, and that's the legislative, which you may also know of as Congress, the executive branch, which is also that's the president is the head of that branch, and the judicial branch. The judicial branch includes the federal courts as well as the Supreme Court. So separating powers into those three branches was the first remedy to try and make sure that no one aspect of the government kind of got overblown or took too much power. The second constitutional principle is the idea of checks and balances. So once you have the three branches of government, the founders wanted to make sure that each branch had the authority to limit the power of the other branches. So this visual here gives you kind of an overview of how checks and balances work. But the idea is that each branch has some authority and some degree of oversight and control over the actions of others. So each branch, while they have the authority to do what they need to do and they have some amount of power, they also have the power to limit the other branches of government. So you start here with the president or the executive branch. Down here we have the courts or the judicial branch. And down here we have Congress or the legislative branch. So it really depends on the issue as far as what power can be taken and which branch kind of comes to the forefront to challenge the others. But as you can see, I put an example here. I tried to give you a contemporary example. So when you may hear in the news conversations about the president issuing an executive order banning immigration from 7 countries, and they're referring to it as a ban against Muslims. Well, so here's the president in the executive branch exercising what they see as their power. But you may have also heard that a federal judge, which represents the judicial branch, has temporarily blocked the enforcement of the ban, saying there are many aspects of it that are unconstitutional or that may be unconstitutional. So in essence, the power of the president has been limited. It has been blocked to a certain degree by the courts. Now, it may also be possible Congress has not necessarily taken any action at this point, but if we wanted to kind of continue thinking through this issue, theoretically, it may be possible for Congress to say, well, if the Supreme Court says that aspects of the president's ban are unconstitutional, then we want to draft a law that would follow the Constitution. But then that law would, if the president signed that law into office, signed the proposed law into actual law, then that would have a bit more power than an executive order. However, keeping that in mind, when Congress passes laws, the Supreme Court, as you see here, they can declare laws as unconstitutional as well. So the Supreme Court can act on Congress. they have some authority to limit Congress's power, and they can also declare presidential acts unconstitutional. However, Congress has some power over the courts because they approve the federal judges. They also approve those that the president nominates for the Supreme Court. So Congress has that approval. Congress has some power over the president because they can, first they have impeachment power, which we'll talk about a little later, but they also have the power to override some of the president's actions. And then here, between the president and the courts, president has the power to appoint judges, which I mentioned earlier. They also have the power to pardon, but the courts can, limit the president's power as well. Again, it depends on the issue, but we will, with regard to any political issue, and when you're thinking about your topics, it'll be important to note where are the actions being taken and how are the other branches responding and trying to limit the authority of one another. So that's an overview of checks and balances. Federalism is the third constitutional principle. Federalism, all of this happening at the executive branch, judicial branch, and legislative branch, that's all happening at the federal level. However, another way to limit the explosion of political power in one branch or another was to create a federal system wherein, even though we have the federal level of government, we also have state governments, and power is divided between the national or federal level and the state level. And it's just important to note that federal and national are two words, but they're referring to the same thing. Federal level or national level governments are those those aspects of government that have to do with the entire United States, and those are seen as operating at a higher level than the level of state governments. We'll talk about the supremacy clause to the Constitution in a little bit, and that gives the federal government a bit more power, although there are certain powers that the states have in reserve as well. So federalism is the third principle, and it's the idea that power will be divided between the national and the state governments. And there's a two-part goal. There's a reason for this. The first reason is because a strong national government was to be established. I mentioned the supremacy clause before, but the other part of the goal was because the founders did not want to undermine local control. So you can imagine this being a kind of a balancing act. The founders wanted a strong national government because, as you remember before, the Articles of Confederation created a relatively weak national government. So our Constitution was meant to create and support a strong national government while at the same time acknowledging that the states and other, municipalities, et cetera, have the right to exercise some local control. The fourth constitutional principle is interesting because it's relatively broad, and it's meant to kind of say any authority, any other powers that that haven't explicitly been talked about in the Constitution. We don't want someone to try and take power by saying, well, this wasn't detailed. It wasn't detailed which branch actually has this power, so I'm going to take it for myself. So in order to try to prevent any kind of unforeseen power grabs, the founders exercise this principle of limited government, and it underlies our Constitution as well. And basically what it means is that the authority of any public official is written down and it's documented, and it's restricted by law to protect the citizenry. Any authority that is not written down, so if you think of government officials as having job descriptions, any authority that does not explicitly fall within their job description, the idea is that that authority falls to the people. So that government officials would not be allowed to say, well, it's not written down, but I think this is part of my job anyway, and no one else has taken this authority, so I'm going to kind of try to collect more power and more authority for myself. All right, finally, so those are the four constitutional principles. Just to review: separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, and limited government. Another check on political power is this idea of bicameralism. If you remember before, the Articles of Confederation created a unicameral government, one house, and each state had one vote. A bicameral system is the system that we have today, wherein we have two houses, for example, in our national Congress as well as state Congresses, there are two houses, and not only are there two different houses, but they have different sizes, different term limits, and different responsibilities in each house. And again, the purpose was to prevent the national legislature from becoming too powerful, because the founders thought of those three branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. They worried that the legislative would be the dominant institution. They were most worried about legislators trying to take more power than they should have. So they limited this power even more by separating it into two houses. House of Representatives is determined by the state population, so it varies. Bigger states have more representatives, and they also have 2-year terms, whereas the Senate has the same number, 2, for all states, and they have 6-year terms. So that was a final way of limiting power in the legislative branch. In class today, you will engage in a political cartoon review as an activity, so that's something to look forward to in class today and on Friday. Finally, a bit about American Indian relations. I just want to point out, we will be watching a brief documentary, part of a documentary in class, but it's important to note that there have been multiple conflicts between the American settlers and the U.S. government. I mean, between the American settlers and the native peoples ever since the first settlers arrived. It's also important to note that the U.S. Constitution is modeled after the Great Law of Peace. And this is the oldest constitution in North America, and it was the one created for and by the 7 Iroquois nations. So it was created by American Indians, and the founders were very impressed with the Great Law of Peace, and they used it as a model for the current constitution that we've just been covering. It was over 400 years old when the first settlers arrived, and it governed an alliance of Indian tribes. Now, those conflicts that we mentioned, they continue until today. And some of the causes include competition for resources. And as the settlers learned more and more about the United States, about North America and all the resources that were to be gained, then the conflicts became more intense as the settlers attempted to gain power over those areas where they felt the most resources were. There were also population pressures. As more and more settlers arrived, they felt the need to expand their territory because the population kind of could no longer fit in the smaller areas where on the East Coast where the first immigrants were arriving. So they felt the need to kind of expand the territory northward and westward. And finally, there's this idea of manifest destiny, which we'll discuss in class, but it's the belief that God has decided that the North American land, the North American territories were meant for the settlers. So that was kind of used as a rationale or a reason for not only expanding, but also for creating treaties with the American Indians, but then also justification for breaking them. One important act that we want to make sure that we discuss and that you need to remember is the Indian Removal Act. It was passed in 1830. The president was Andrew Jackson. And what it did was it authorized him to negotiate with the Five Nations peoples. The Five Nations peoples were the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, and the original Cherokee nations. However, some of the, and the point of this Indian Removal Act was to negotiate with the Five Nations peoples and ask them if they would be willing to move from some of the areas that were coveted by the settlers. Basically, they were on lands that were theirs, their ancestral lands, and the president was interested in asking the Five Nations peoples to move from their lands in exchange for other territories that were to be given through treaties. In class, we will talk a little bit more about treaties, but it's important to note just the basic definition that a treaty is a formal agreement between two sovereign nations. And also, we'll talk a bit about what it means for a treaty to be ratified or unratified. And then, as I mentioned, we will be viewing a segment of a documentary called Mini Wiconi, Water is Life, and that sheds a little bit more light on the history of American Indians with American settlers. So in conclusion, this module has covered the basic dilemmas that underlie American government. It's covered an understanding of how and why majority and minority groups are created. We've talked a bit about this process of social construction and the impact that it has. We've looked at several key periods before and during the creation of the Constitution. And finally, we reflected a bit on the relationship between Americans and American Indians. So we will be discussing this information in class, but we'll also have more opportunity to work with the information. So I encourage you to bring your questions, your comments to class, because that'll be the place where we will engage